I'm John Walensky, and this is The Future of Information. I want to give a brief talk about the history of open access. This is going to span the whole of the 21st century, at least as far as we've gone so far, and we'll talk about how people get their hands on the latest research, on current scholarship, and what's changing in terms of how knowledge circulates. At the same time, I want you to remember that this comes out of a long past in terms of universities and monasteries, where the circulation and access to knowledge has always been an issue and always been a goal in terms of improving it. Let me start this history of open access with a little bit of a backstory. Let me sweep back, in fact, centuries and centuries to the early Middle Ages, to the 4th and 5th century. Now, this was a period of manuscript culture when all of knowledge was transmitted largely orally, but in terms of writing and books, illuminated handwritten manuscripts. And these were preserved in the monasteries, they were circulated through the West, and they were the main means of sharing knowledge with a very small group of nuns and monks in monasteries engaged in this work. This is the mid-15th century. When books begin to be printed, it was developed much earlier in China and Korea, but it comes to the West, or at least it was invented in the West, in the mid-15th century. And the printed book did revolutionize, did make it possible for works to be standardized, for example, instead of being copied out one by one, made it available for many, many more people than an illuminated handwritten manuscript did, but still was very expensive and was limited in terms of who could afford a copy, but did a great deal for increasing the circulation of knowledge. They were easy to ship, they lasted for a very long time, and they were a very strong part of how people got access to learning. But our real story begins in the 21st century, or at the end, and the earliest forms in terms of research and scholarship in which this material was circulated were the few people experimenting with online journals. Journals had been around for centuries, going back to the 17th century, but here were people saying that maybe on the internet we could circulate these in a whole new way. We could put them online, and everyone who had access to the internet would be able to see the latest research and scholarship. They were simple, they were hard to read, and they were in the form of screens full of print. But they were the research, and only a very few began to experiment with this in the 1990s. And I was a part of that. In that period, I thought that this was a way of developing a new kind of public knowledge, that we would be able to circulate research freely and fully for the first time outside of university libraries and available to anyone, any public library. This period of the late 90s, people started to have Wi-Fi in their homes, and knowledge was beginning to, at least we thought, was beginning to circulate freely in a few experiments in this way. Journals began to move online in the 21st century, in the early 2000s. And one of the first that developed a new kind of model was Biomed Central. What they did was put articles, research articles in the biomedical field online, and they did so by charging the authors. Here was a financial model where they didn't need to sell subscriptions to libraries. All they needed to do was charge the author a few $100s, and they could put their article online. The authors, the researchers, they could pay for it through their research grants. The biomedical field is very well funded. NIH, National Institutes of Health, has a very large budget that it distributes. It's about $30 million today. Early 2000s, it was much less than that, but there still was a fair bit of money in that field. So the early part of the 21st century, we began to see a new kind of journal appear that charged what became known as an article processing charge. And the APC was one financial model for making journals available, because at the same time, most of the publishers were still selling classic print journals in this lovely form, beautiful covers. No, they were quite pedantic in a way, filled with research and discoveries. But they were torn, the publishers were torn between going online and finding a successful financial model and continuing to sell subscription journals to libraries. And so what we had at that time were stacks and stacks of journals bound in hideous colors, as this picture shows you, and where you would spend your time looking up where an article was and then tracking it down through the stacks. then perhaps photocopying it or working directly from it in the text. So the 21st century began in that first decade, at least, with a whole range of possible models between print and online. The emerging one was the open access article processing charge version, which the authors had to pay. And there were, at the same time, though, there were a whole series of journals that decided to go online without charging authors or readers, that would be based on the volunteer contributions of scholars, that would get small grants to go online, and move forward in a fairly reasonable way. In fact, the world is still divided between those journals that don't charge authors and those that do, with the majority, well, at least in the number of journals, the majority don't charge the authors and are free to readers. But in the number of articles being published, and we'll look at some of the mega journals where there are huge numbers of articles being published, they are under article processing charges that authors are required to pay if their article is accepted for publication, and with some opportunities for a waiver if you're unable to pay the charges. Those charges now were in the hundreds in Biomed Central's day. Today, I would say that $3,000 is a reasonable estimate of the current most common figure charged per article. Multiple authors sometimes, and an occasional waiver. But another development started to happen, and that was a realization that knowledge could be shared globally in a way that it never could when it was in print. It was easy enough to make all of the articles in the world available to developing countries, to the global south, in a brand new way. And Research for Life is a very good example of that. A series of projects came together, and the major publishers were happy to donate their content, that is all of their journal content, to an organization like Research for Life that then could make this material available to everyone in the world. No, not to everyone in the world, and to those countries that qualified, that were poor enough that they would never subscribe to the journals, and therefore there was no loss for the publishers, and at the same time they could do good by making this knowledge available to them. Now my project, the Public Knowledge Project, which you saw a few moments ago, was part of that activity. The software was used to create African journals online. Here was a place where African journals, instead of just receiving knowledge from the North, could contribute their own understanding and research and scholarship, and could engage in a global knowledge exchange. And African Journals Online started with a couple of hundred journals and is now in the area of about 500 journals. Another development that's worth attending to is the mega journal. This is PLOS One, the Public Library of Science. All of its articles are online, and all of PLOS's articles in about 6 or 7 journals are free. They charge an APC that ranges from about $1,500 to $3,000. PLOS One, though, accepts a great number of articles. It had 30,000 articles a year or so ago, per year. It's down a little bit from that because there are other mega journals competing against it now. The difference is that between the mega journal and the regular journal is they accept submissions across the board of all the sciences, and they do so on the basis of competency. That is, the research is peer-reviewed, it's felt to be competent, and it doesn't have to compete against other articles for space. It can be published, and it's a new kind of model that comes out of open access. The idea that all research that is well done should be openly and freely shared for people to dip into. But at the same time, there were smaller journals that began to develop. And here's an example from the software that my projects developed. Open Journal Systems is the software, and Locke Studies is an example of a small journal dedicated to the work of the philosopher John Locke that doesn't charge the authors like PLOS does, and PLOS One in particular does. It doesn't charge the readers. It's free online. But it's a smaller journal in the sense that instead of 30,000 articles, it might publish 20 or 30 or 40 articles a year with strong support from peer reviewers who always give their work for free, so that's not any different. But the editors, journal manager may be volunteering or have a small grant in order to support the journal. So in terms of the growth of open access, another important development is to realize that it is now the accepted norm that one of the top journals in the field, Nature, now has its own open access mega journal, Scientific Reports. charging in the area of $5,000 per article. But what it has done is establish that open access is not a matter of lesser quality. The very best journals have open access versions. What we're caught at is a kind of midpoint between the subscription journals, which still dominate, and the open access versions, which almost every publisher has some version of at this point. Here we have the growth from 1950 to 2015 of open access, which are the colored areas, different kinds of open access. I'm not going to get into the details of that. But against the general gray, you can see that open access is increasing even as the number of articles is increasing. And that in the area of around 30% of the articles today are freely available and 70% are still locked up in subscription journals that not every library can afford access to. And the question for the future of information, the key element going forward, is how do we close that gap between the 70% that are not available publicly and the 30-odd% that are? There are a whole variety of models, and we'll discuss some of them. But the key aspect in terms of the future of information is the question of how do we make open access a universal, a public right to know. The big question going into the future of open access is the question of how do we get to universal open access? How do we realize all of the research and scholarship in the world as part of a human right to know? At this point, there's a great deal of tension between the academic community and the corporate publishers who have owned a majority of the research up to now. Now that it's going to circulate freely, and we've all agreed upon that part, who's going to control that process? What are the costs going to be? Because it's not going to be free. And how is it going to be paid for? So at this point, as we approach the halfway mark in terms of open access, there's a big question still to come. And each of us will be participating in that because now that this knowledge is public and part of a human right, we all have a say in that. How is the control of that research and scholarship going to be distributed? How are we going to ensure that everyone has the access they need? Those are the questions we need to pay attention to, have a voice about, and continue to be concerned with.